Um, yeah, thank you. I will, as you said, present my recent thesis on the origin and development of the shieling system and transhuman practices during the Iron Age and medieval period. It's mainly going to be about Norway, but also with an outlook towards the rest of Scandinavia and the North Atlantic. The main title is called Samad fornleifafræði hever verít, which is a quote from the Gulating law, which I will return to in a minute. I'll just first mention that the work is supported by Møre and Romsdal County Authority and the Norwegian Research Council, and a doctoral degree was obtained at the Norwegian University for Science and Technology in Trondheim. Now, my personal background is from a farm with a shieling, and this picture displays my grandfather and my mother as a young dairymaid in the early 1960s. I think this site is probably where I started my career as a young kid, collecting scrap metal and other stuff, and wondering about life in the past. So this close connection to the field of study provides a solid dwelling perspective, but I'm also curious about what modern science and technology has to offer. Across most of Norway, shielings on summer farming was a key component of the traditional Norwegian farmscape, and following its peak around 1850, it was also kind of glorified by nationalist and romantic currents within art and literature. One of my supervisors, Caroline Daugstad, has studied how the Shielings was increasingly displayed as an illuminated cultural spot in contrast to dramatic natural surroundings, as something inherently Norwegian and with deep historical roots. Shielings are mentioned in the 12th century Gulating law, where it stated that the markers and paths should remain as they've been since ancient times. Samad fornleifafræði hever verít. The title thus refers to my archaeological inquiry of the Shielings and the question of whether they have, in fact, always been the same. The Shielings are also mentioned by the 11th century cleric and historian Adam of Bremen, who argued that the Norwegian lifestyle, herding their flocks far off into the solitudes, living off of milk and wool, was what made them so great warriors or fighters. So my main research question is thus how the shieling system emerged and developed across Norway in the Iron Age and medieval period. And this will also be my main topic today. This question also involves some more methodological and managemental questions that I will briefly touch upon, such as how do we identify shielings in the archaeological record, how can various methods improve their visibility, and what is considered best practice when investigating shielings. Sometimes we do find proper house foundations like the one at the bottom here, but most often the traces are concealed by later activity and thus mainly visible as subsurface deposits. So I'll start this presentation by presenting some of the theories on the origin and development of the shieldings and general tendencies in former studies before I will present my own approach and conclude with a chronological narrative based on my own investigations. And if there's time, I will also do some short reflections concerning best practice. Now, the Shielings began to attract scholarly interest by the beginning of the 20th century, often by priests like Olaf Olafsson or other local historians. Their studies often had ethnological or functionalistic approaches, and based on the common sense, it was argued that the Shielings resulted from grazing pressure. Due to the lack of pastures around the farm, the cattle moved up to the mountains and the people followed after. In the 1920s, the Shielings drew more and more attention, both in Norway and Sweden, and large surveys were conducted to collect ethnographical data on Shielings, systems, names, and traditions, resulting in several large publications. In Sweden, John Frodin also proposed a new theory that the Shielings were primary to the farm. From a mobile settlement pattern, the use of some sites were intensified and the settlements stabilized into farms. This perspective was also elaborated by Björn Haugen in his publication From Shieling to Farm. The most famous publication, however, is Lars Reinton's trilogy on Shielings in Norway, in which he differentiated between full Shielings with dairy production, milk Shielings without dairy production, and hay Shielings. His perspectives on the origins was also influenced by evolutionary perspectives, but he argued that this process happened before the introduction of farming and animal husbandry, and that the shieling system was introduced by the battle axe culture in the Neolithic. Still, the archaeological evidence was still very sparse and mainly based on what we may now call inadequate proxies. This was about to change as a new law on ancient monuments was passed in 1951. And from the late 1950s until 1990, most of the archaeological evidence on Shielings was collected during large-scale surveys and excavations that were done prior to the construction of great hydroelectric dams. A lot of house foundations were uncovered, mainly across Western Norway, and after this, some scholars still argue that their origins may go all the way back to the Indo-Europeans and the migrations, but there were also neo-functionalistic approaches connecting their emergence to things like environmental changes, demography, and climate. With the post-processual archaeology, the use of Shielings was also considered as a human innovation or a human strategy, and not only as a deterministic response to environmental changes. In Norway, several student projects supervised by Ingvild Øye also demonstrated great antiquity of the historical Shielings, the ones that were in use by the end of the 19th century or 20th century, with roots far back to the Roman Iron Age. And one of those was my very own. My survey in the Romsdal region as part of my master study displayed several waves of activity at later Shielings, and I argue there may have been a stepwise development through the last 2,000 years or so. The current PhD is in many ways a follow-up with a larger geographical focus, looking at both chronology and regional variation, but also at managemental practices and methods. One of the main questions relates to the uneven archaeological record of Iron Age Shielings and medieval Shielings across Norway. As you can see from this map, most of the Shielings are registered in Western Norway. So is this pattern real or mainly a result of different methods and managemental practices and so on? So that's my thesis there. My approach has been multifaceted, and first of all, I've been looking at traditional sources like historical records and place names, and the results from traditional archaeological surveys. This includes both visible features, soil probing and test pitting, searching for archaeological deposits. And I've been using these data both for statistical analysis and to prioritize some sites for larger, although still small-scale investigations. And this is what a typical deposit may appear like. The selection was further based on the use of a range of non-invasive methods, such as LiDAR and image-based modeling. And I've been trying, together with my co-authors, to tweak the data and to display small topographical variations that may reflect subsurface settlements. I've also tried thermography to see whether subsurface stone structures may be reflected by surface temperatures. And to get a better grasp of what is hidden underground, I've also been using geophysical methods, such as ground-penetrating radar, magnetometer or gradiometer, and measures of magnetic susceptibility on the topsoil. For the sites that I followed up with small trenches, I also did extensive sampling of environmental data. Monoliths for pollen analysis were collected from bogs close by the sites. I collected tins from micromorphology, mainly to study the floor levels, or what I interpreted as floor levels. In Iceland, on the British Isles, you may know that Karen Milek and Patricia Kupiak have studied how seasonality could be reflected by thin lenses of Aeolian sand, but this was not uncovered in any of my thin sections. Perhaps both due to environmental differences and also to different architecture. I also collected a monolith from each trench that were later studied for various purposes in the laboratory. This included XRF and element analysis, optically blue light and infrared stimulated luminescence, which could give me relative dating from the various levels and also indicate any disturbances, for instance, from farming and cultivation. As you can see from the pink layer, there's more disturbances in the edges, which may come from disturbances. Measures of magnetic susceptibility and loss on ignition further contributed to the interpretation of the various layers. At this site, for instance, there is a clear change where the floor level was located around 20 centimeters below the surface. And based on studies in Iceland, I also tried to collect insect remains as proxies for animal species and hay storage, but the preservation was very poor, and only a few occurrences of dung beetles were relevant for the study. The preservation of ancient DNA in the sediments was also very poor and dominated by bacteria and rodents, and with surprisingly little evidence of domestic animals. The best proxy, although indirect, was probably to look at the microbiomes that were typical for the various species and their guts and also other environments. So how do I understand the emergence and the development? And first of all, and mainly as a methodological approach and not something inherent in time itself, at least to keep Gavin happy, I have distinguished between four main phases that I have tried to study per se and based on their variance remnants from each of those periods. And as you can see, they are all separated by the blue bars in the lower panel, which are phases of less activity than what you would expect, while the red bars are phases with more activity than you would expect from a theoretical null model. So this has then led to the four main phases. First is the late lithic period, that is the Bronze Age and Iron Age prior to the expansion of local bog iron production. The late Roman and migration period, and the late Iron Age up to the High Middle Ages, which may be most interesting for Icelandic conditions, and also from the late Middle Ages and early modern period. And as you can see from these dates, there are periods of decline in between each of these periods with little or less activity at the shieling sites. So starting with the beginning, we can see a great expansion in a number of dates around 2100 BC, which is probably related to the introduction of, or expansion at least, of agriculture. This could be both due to migration of Indo-Europeans, but also diffusion of agripastoral practices. So this is kind of the starting point for discussing Shielings and transhumans. Some famous sites are known, such as Skriverhelleren rock shelter and Urutlekroi in the inner Sogn region further south in western Norway, which may reflect transhuman practices. There's also some traces of cup marks, rock art, at several historical shieling sites, which may also be attributed to this time period. In my region, Møre and Romsdal, on the northwestern coast of Norway, there are less conclusive evidence of shieldings in this period, but there are traces of fire clearance in the shielding landscape that may reflect some kind of transhuman practices going all the way back to 2000 BC. The great expansion, however, into the shielding landscape occurs in the pre-Roman Iron Age, the centuries prior to the birth of Christ. This is part of a general agripastoral expansion, also in the lowlands. So you can see when there's a high peak in the lowlands, there's also incipient activity in the shieling landscape to the right. This development is also supported by the pollen analysis, displaying short-term clearances with increase of charcoal dust, reduced traces of pine, and increase of birch. Now, although problematic in many ways, it's interesting to see this expansion into the mountain areas in relation to Peter's description of the people in Thule and how they drove their cattle into the mountains and stay there during the summer. This is the same time period. The agripastoral expansion in the pre-Roman Iron Age was followed by a drop around the birth of Christ, and the declines are displayed by the blue bars, as I mentioned, and this is visible both in the lowlands and especially at the Shielings, where all the evidence seemed to disappear in this 400-year time period. The pollen analysis also showed traces of reforestation. Based on this, I've argued that there is some kind of abrupt change in the settlement in this period that may be related to development of the farm and the field and meadow system, and whether this is caused by natural disasters like volcanic eruptions or plague is, of course, uncertain. Lars-Erik Jerpe has discussed what he refers to as a possible 207 BC dust wheel event, arguing that this may have triggered social and economic changes, such as the introduction of iron. The main thing, however, seemed to be the restructuration of the agrarian settlement and introduction of a new and interconnected socio-economic system. The introduction of iron and the contraction of the settlement into central areas was also followed by increased hay production, for instance, due to the introduction of scythes and harvesting tools, and the possibilities of indoor housing, which also led to more manure and intensified agricultural practices. This in turn led to more stable dwellings and more stable field systems and things like odal and territorial rights and increased social stratification. Eventually, as this pressure increased in these central lowland areas, often along the river valleys and so on, this led to new expansions and a more hierarchical settlement structure, as, for instance, described by Dagfinn Skræ in eastern Norway. A similar model has also been proposed by Siv Kristoffersen in Western Norway, with a main settlement in the lowland and various sub-settlements collecting various resources in the mountains in what she describes as a decentralized farm structure. In Sweden, Andreas Hanius has described some of the same processes, from mobile and more random settlement in the pre-Roman Iron Age into more fixed sites where the resource pressure also led to the emergence of seasonal settlements. I have also one article in my PhD discussing some of these processes with focus on farm names ending in the setter suffix. And now this is a picture from one of the coastal farms, central farm with a lot of settler settlements in the surroundings. So these settlements have a peripheral location, and they have been discussed as possible former Iron Age shieldings. Both the names, both setter and sater, which means shieling, have the same etymological origin as a place where one is sitting or staying. As a farm name, mainly based on the occurrence of graves, they are typically dated to the late Iron Age, but the names may initially have denoted sites with slightly different functions. What is strange, however, is the geographical mismatch between the setter names, as you can see here, and the sater names as well, and that are concentrated to eastern Norway and central Norway, compared to the distribution of shieldings in the archaeological record, which are focused on concentrated in western Norway. Looking at the sites in the county of Møre and Romsdal, which is having plenty of set names, there's also a mismatch in the elevation. The setter names are typically marginal settlements, but mainly in the lowlands. Yet over time, and with an expanding lowland settlement, some of these settler sites, as the most peripheral sites, may have extended into the outlands and marginal mountain areas, still within the framework of a decentralized farm model. Looking at all the radiocarbon dates from settler settlements, it's difficult to relate the date to specific place names in central lowland areas, which has had more or less continuous settlement throughout prehistory. In the Shieling landscape, however, the archaeological traces are more focused, both in time and space, making such connection between name and archaeological evidence more valid. Above 250 meters, as you can see from this model, it seems as if the settler sites in Møre and Romsdal have dates between the migration period and the Middle Ages, and this may concur with the lowland settler settlements to be somewhat older. So we might have, after this decline around the birth of Christ, there might have been an expansion in the settlement in the Roman Iron Age, and then later in the peripheral areas. Some well-known investigations suggest that the settler settlements should be dated to the late Roman Iron Age and migration period onwards. And Svolset is also interpreted as a seasonal settlement, and thus one of the earliest Shielings documented. In my study area, we have still no definite traces of settlement, but the archaeological deposits start to become more substantial by the end of this period and into the subsequent Merovingian period, and often located to sites, historical settings, Shielings, with the settler suffix, such as here at Hammerset, with the date below, Myrset and Klovset as well, all having dates between the 5th and the 7th century. The question, of course, is whether these should be considered as farms or Shielings, or as something in between, or perhaps prior to both. At Sandnesetra, site with dates going back to the Roman Iron Age, the pollen analysis display quite intensive use throughout the period, that even included cereal cultivation. Most sites from the period, however, are still quite ephemeral, mainly consisting of fire clearing, fireplaces, cooking pits, and the like in phase 1. They may still represent herder camps or milking sites, as also indicated by the original denotation of the term støl or stodul. So not necessarily having buildings at all. A review of the archives shows that the house foundations interpreted as Shielings from the early Iron Age is mainly found within the Sogn region in central western Norway. This coincides with the distribution of a specific variant of the settler suffix, place names ending in sete, as you can see here. These are almost exclusively Shielings, and the suffix is also closer to the Sæter suffix with a long open vowel. And to the right, you can also see the Shielings ending in stødul having a wider distribution, although concentrated around the same Western Norwegian area. In the 6th and 7th century, there's a new decline, although the Shieling landscape may have been less affected and was released by new growth after less than 100 years. Brita Hope, who has made a synthesis of all the dates in Sogn in Vestland County, she suggests great continuity from the late Roman Iron Age all the way up to the High Middle Ages in this area. What she notices, however, is a slight and gradual change in the architecture, from large rectangular buildings to more horseshoe-shaped buildings. And this is also when we first start to see the traces of buildings in Møre and Romsdal. And in the Viking Age, we can see a rapid increase of both house foundations and more substantial archaeological deposits. And you can also see here the following decline in the 14th century next to it. This is one of the oldest foundations in the southern part of the county, and the part that is closest to Vestland County. And as shown by the LiDAR images, there are, you can see it's of course very hard to see those on photographs, as I know you may know. But there are three buildings here that are similar to the one to the left, and also similar to the ones found in Sogn. And one of these were dated to the late Viking Age. I re-examined one of the others, the one that you can see on the left-hand side, and the geophysics, as you can see, displayed a lot of stones even in the opening, which was interpreted as collapsed gable wall. And I dug a trench through this, which kind of confirmed or supported my interpretation. A new radiocarbon analysis from the floor layer of this site produced a somewhat later date than the other shieling. Here's another one, also in the southernmost part. And this was found in a lot tougher terrain, in which it was very hard to employ any non-invasive methods. It was not visible in the LiDAR results or in any of the other non-invasive methods, but it was still acknowledgeable in the field and dated to the late Viking Age and early Middle Ages. And this is from the trench. You can see the wall there, and there was also a post hole pit that was dated to the High Middle Ages. From this period onwards, we also start to see more rectangular buildings, which may suggest timber log buildings, but it could also signify a change of concept. If we return to the place names, I've already discussed the setter sites and the more typical sete sites in Sogn, with dates starting from the early Iron Age and reaching a peak around 1000 AD. So these dates are all from Westland County, the neighboring county. But from this period on, around 1000 AD, there's also a second type of place names, the sel names, as you have got on Iceland, and with radiocarbon dates reaching a peak by the end of the High Middle Ages. If we look at the spatial distribution of these sel names, they are located not only to the Sogn region, but also to Møre and Romsdal further north. And this distribution is also fairly similar to the distribution of radiocarbon dates from the same period. Later, the shieling spread to the rest of Western Norway and also to Eastern and Central Norway, resulting in new site suffixes, which I will return to later. So my hypothesis is that this reflects some kind of specialization into dairy production. We can see how the dates in Møre and Romsdal spread from the south, the ones marked in red, to the north, and also from the inner fjords to the central fjord districts, the one in orange first and foremost. And this is also where shielings were most common in recent centuries, as this heat map displays. At the same time, we see less evidence of other activities such as iron production and hunting and so on. And if we look at what natural specimens were collected in the different zones as taxes, land rent, and so on, according to late medieval sources, we can also see how butter, which is marked in red on this map, dominates in the central fjord region, whereas grain, fish, and other marine goods are prevalent further west. This development may also be affected by new towns and new urban markets that developed in the early Middle Ages onwards. And we can see how most of the shielings from this period cluster in the hinterlands of the two medieval towns, Veøy and Borgund. Now, most literature on shielings focuses on how this system spread from Norway and Scandinavia across the North Atlantic, but I also believe the inspiration may have gone the other way around, especially from the British Isles, where they also had transhuman systems, such as the Erindi sites. One important technological invention that is assumed to have reached Scandinavia around 1000 AD is the plunge churn, making it possible to produce larger quantities of butter. In addition, this was a time of great social changes, with single farms paying land rent rather than the magnet farms, the extended families, and the decentralized farm system that dominated in the Iron Age. Reducing the framework to the nuclear family also may have affected gender relations, with women having a more important responsibility. In the High Middle Ages, then this system was formalized, constitutionalized, and manifested by written laws, arguing it had been the same since time immemorial. So summing up, the development in this period started out with some marginal subordinate settlements, whether farm or shieling, and some open-air milking sites, stöðul, and gradually these two concepts merged, and the settlement became more and more related to the shieling landscape, whereas that's the seter settlements, whereas sel, the dwellings, were erected at some milking sites. And as the social system changed with subordinate settlements and vertical type patron-client relations becoming less important, seter and sater kind of merged into the new concept of sater, with sel and stoder rather referring to the buildings and the outdoor areas respectively. At the national level, this development across Western Norway into specialized shieldings could perhaps be paralleled with a specialization into iron production and reindeer trapping in other parts of Norway, as well as in Sweden. As mentioned before, this expansion also ended in the 14th century with the Black Death. And from my own dates and the number of dates here, we can see a new period of decline. And then followed by the late medieval agrarian crisis. However, this does not seem to be the case in Eastern Norway. By studying medieval diplomas, we can see how mentions of shieldings are distributed across the country, both before and after 1350. The map to the left shows the occurrence of shieldings prior to 1350, with shieldings concentrated to the same area in Western Norway, whereas the late medieval diploma are most often from Eastern Norway. And as these letters often refers to disputes, it may say something about grazing pressure. And both in Norway and Sweden, it has been argued that the summer farming may have expanded after the Black Death due to the collapse in the markets for reindeer trapping and bog ore production. And this picture is from an excavation in eastern Norway this last summer in an area with former reindeer trapping. As a lot of farmer farms were turned into shieldings, there's also a new change of concept. This may be reflected by new place names, signifying shieldings, either underlining abandonment itself, such as Aun, Øygar, and so on, or in the enclosed hay fields, which are prevalent in Eastern Norway. The sites are getting larger and with increased focus on hay production in these in the early modern period. And I believe it's probably through these processes we should understand things like the hay shieldings, the winter shieldings, and the regional variation in the shielding systems. These changes all resulted in a new socio-technological complex with a new set of features such as enclosures, small clearance cairns, charcoal lenses, and traces of cereals from the initial clearing of these sites. New types of buildings entered the scene with cattle byres and hay barns, and by placing the byres as part of the enclosure, energy in the form of manure was moved from the surrounding pastures into the hay fields. So they kind of changed their character. We can also see a change in location in this time period. Whereas the shieldings in the Viking Age were often located at farms with a vertical profile, that is a steep yet short way to the shielding, right up from the farm, as you can see in the bottom of the valley behind the shielding there, to distant valleys, some up to 50, 60 kilometers away, yet with a great potential for hay production. And you can see the red bars are also signifying periods of intensified use. So then, to sum it all up, I argue that the origins of the shieling system should be considered as a gradual, or rather step-by-step emergence, with some periods being more significant than others. For Møre and Romsdal, I would in particular highlight the great changes in the late Viking Age and early Middle Ages, but as we've seen, there's great local variation. And returning to the various explanations, I would say there's a lot of different factors working at different temporal scales, from the inherent quality of the landscape across conjunctures such as demography and social and economic changes, to the more strategic and opportunistic human actions, for instance, regarding surplus production. Now, in my thesis, I conclude that the regional variation is real due to socioeconomic and cultural historical variation in the past. Still, these patterns get further strengthened and reinforced by current managemental practices. In counties that have found the remains of Shielings, who have kind of cracked the code, so to speak, the focus, the strategies, and the methods to find more sites are better, leading to a certain managemental bias. So I've also been discussing how we can cope with this, and I've suggested some measures. First of all, the problem with fixed job contracts is that most archaeologists today kind of grow up and get their experience within one area or one institution, in contrast to some decades ago when everyone went from fieldwork to fieldwork across the country. One way to deal with this and to get more experienced fieldworkers is through secondment and collaboration across boundaries, both regions and perhaps nations as well. Data sharing is also important, but we also need good ontologies in our databases so that the same features end up in the same category across the country. And finally, I really support the development of scientific evaluation programs, looking at the state of art for the various site types, asking questions together and suggesting new research questions, strategies, and also methods for development-led archaeology. And the final slide, I'll just present a case study. By coincidence, I was so lucky to be invited to a shieling project last summer in Innlandet County in eastern Norway, which gave me the opportunity to test my own methods outside the area with the main concentration of shieldings. This was also a watercourse project. As usual, I started with a visual survey, coring and test bitting, and found a deposit underneath the topsoil from the 14th century. The following, this was in 2023, and in the following summer, I had the opportunity to follow up with non-invasive methods and more systematic coring. I tried magnetic susceptibility, which unfortunately gave poor results. What I mainly mapped was the impact of erosion. And based on systematical soil coring, however, I was able to limit the site area, and the GPR investigations also pointed at some interesting features. So what you can see here was my interpretation prior to excavation last summer, and what you can see, the thick lines display modern features, but the dotted line and number 6 and number 4 is probably what we interpreted as possible earlier shieling sites, shieling buildings. There was no charcoal in number 6, so we interpret this as a possible byre, whereas number 4 was interpreted as a possible the shieling sites. We followed up with a trench, and in what we interpreted as a cattle byre, we actually found the remains of the timber, the floorboards that had decomposed into soil right beneath the turf. It's very, very shallow there. And we also found the other building, but what we interpret as the waste disposal zone may most likely represent the inside of a 2-room timber log building with no visible wall foundations at all. The test pit that we dug 2 years in advance was found in the center of the fireplace. And as you can see from this picture, we interpret this as a two-room building, perhaps between a living room in the back and a sunken dairy shed in the front, which could be very much according to what is mentioned in Laxdøla saga, Selin var thvau, svevnsel och bur. So this is kind of a very good result of my project and the shieling made visible. Thank you.
Thank you, Kristoffer. So we have time for some questions. I would suggest you just use the raise hand button or type